Hey, I'm Trey. 20 years as a police officer, 10 of which as a detective. I've always been curious about serial killers. They all tend to have red flags, which is why I started this channel. Hopefully you'll feel just as curious as I am, wanting to identify those red flags so you can protect yourself and your family from these type of killers. If you have any questions about serial killers in general, or even comments, please leave them in the comment section. Well, if you're ready, let's get started. September 1992, in the country of Australia. In a very rural area, two friends who happen to love running typically take this route regularly and usually don't encounter anything out of the ordinary. Just a little ways off the jogging path, something caught the attention of one of the joggers. Something looked amiss to their friends. They ran this jogging path enough times that they were familiar with all the surroundings. This particular day, they observed a large clump of brush and leaves in a large pile that wasn't there before, which looked a little unnatural. Both friends were a little apprehensive at first because it was one of those situations where you decide, should you just mind your own business or go in to investigate? As they got closer, it became obvious to both of them that it was a concealed corpse of a woman. It was becoming dusk, but the friends were able to jog back fast enough to contact the police and show them where they found it before it became completely dark outside. The authorities collected as much evidence in the dark as they could, with plans to complete the investigation in the morning. An officer was posted there overnight to protect the scene from being tampered with by anyone, including the local wildlife. The following morning, the police picked up where they left off in order to locate any additional clues that they may have missed the previous evening. That's when they discovered a second body of another woman just a few feet away from the first victim. Police quickly confirmed via dental records that the bodies were those of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, who had been missing since April. For context, by the time these first two murders were discovered, at least 7 backpackers had been reported missing over the course of 4 years in the same general area. The police didn't assume initially that it could have been the work of a serial killer because the area was so rural and vast. I don't think I would go hiking any place where people regularly turn up missing. That's just nuts to me. Many hikers that were inexperienced would go into the forest against the advice of the authorities, then lose their way, never to be located alive again. The police didn't have the resources to search for people continuously, so they would do the best that they could and then call off the search after they felt like they've done enough. What does felt like they've done enough mean? Does that mean they just take a lap around the block and say, okay, it's lunchtime? And then they would just have to wait until their bodies would eventually turn up and complete an autopsy to determine if their deaths were accidental or homicide. When these two bodies were located, the police were able to determine that they were both murdered. That's where the murder investigation actually began. In October of 1993, a local man, whose name was not provided, was searching for firewood to heat his home. While he was reaching down to collect several logs, he accidentally struck a large human bone, possibly an arm, in a remote section of the forest. He was obviously alarmed by this and ran to contact the authorities. He returned with the police to the scene. Authorities set up a large crime scene and stumbled upon an additional victim's body. An autopsy was done on each victim, and they were later identified as James Gibson and Deborah Everest. The police had located the backpacks of these victims discarded about 75 miles away from where they were found. Now that the police were sure that they had 4 murdered victims, they began to step up their patrols in these isolated areas with explicit instructions to search for more bodies or strangers. In November of that year, another skeleton was found in a clearing in the forest by a patrolling officer. It was later identified as Simone Schmidt. Clothing found at that scene matched another missing backpacker by the name of Anja Hapsheed. Just a few days later, the bodies of Anja and Gabor Neubauer were found in a nearby shallow grave by patrolling officers. The police were baffled because they had at least 5 murdered victims with the possibility of a 6th based on the recovered clothing of the 6th missing person with very few leads. The local news did a story requesting help from any witnesses that could help the authorities with any of these cases. After the story was ran, the police received a call from a man by the name of Paul Onions. Paul had just recently visited Australia from the UK. He stated that he had been backpacking in the area where several of the victims were found. While hitchhiking, he accepted a ride from a man only known as Bill. Bill stopped his car abruptly after a few minutes of driving. He pulled out a revolver with some rope, stating that this was a robbery. Paul was smart enough to know that if this was really a robbery, there would be no need for ropes. The stranger had a gun and could have just ordered Paul just to hand over all his belongings, and he wouldn't put up any resistance. At that moment, Paul fled for his life and ran to a passing stranger's car for help. Paul was able to describe the assailant and his vehicle to the local police. Because there weren't too many people in the area that matched the vehicle and the operator's description, the police had a fairly good idea of who this stranger was. A man by the name of Ivan Milat was known to the local authorities due to years of police encounters and arrests stemming from as far back as his childhood. Police began surveillance of Milat's house in February. Police learned that Milat had recently sold his vehicle that was described during the attack of Paul Onions shortly after the discovery of the bodies of Clark and Waters by police. The authorities had verified that he had not worked on any of the days of the attacks of the missing deceased victim. Milat was arrested on robbery and weapons charges related to Onion's attack. The police did a criminal history of Milat and found that in April of 1971, he was charged with the abduction of two 18-year-old hitchhikers and the rape of one of them. His attorney was ultimately able to persuade the jury to find him not guilty. While awaiting the trial, he was involved in a string of robberies with some of his brothers before faking his suicide and fleeing to New Zealand. He returned to Australia after a year and was able to avoid prison time by staying out of sight. Then he remained under the radar of the authorities until he began his killing spree. A search was done of the premises and several guns that were used to kill during the attacks were found along with the property belonging to several of the dead victims. A search of Milat's mother's home and brother's residence also produced several of the murdered victims' personal items. Milat was arrested and charged for the murders. Several members of his family were also arrested for possession of stolen items from the murdered victim. Milat pled not guilty and implicated several of his family members with being involved with the homicide. Milat was found guilty on all charges. Milat was given a life sentence on each count of homicide, totaling 7, without the possibility of parole. If you enjoyed more stories such as these, just click on the suggested video above. God bless you and stay safe.